Hey everyone, I'm Lydia.
Hi everyone, this is Avery.
Hey, it's Catherine.
And welcome to week 2 of PLIX Urban Ecology Online. Today, we'll be talking about the tangible ecosystem. Ahead of that, I just wanted to give an update on a few upcoming dates. So we have our final week of Urban Ecology Online next Thursday, May 28th at 12 again. 2 weeks after that, on June 11th, we'll be having Space Food Online, a workshop on that activity. And we have some more workshops coming up soon that we'll make sure to get the dates out for. So just to go over the agenda for today, we're in the middle of our welcome right now. And then Avery is going to give a short presentation on people in cities and giving facilitation tips for the activity. Then we'll have a 30-minute breakout session going over what ideas you have for running this activity in your library, any questions you may have or facilitation ideas. And then we'll get back together at the end, have any questions answered and share as a group.
Great, so welcome back to week 2, everybody. Super excited to discuss the activity called the Tangible Ecosystem with all of you. The point of this workshop is to not only expand our toolkit for exploring the urban environment, but also learning how to trace relationships between different ecosystem components in the city. So before we dive into the actual content of the workshop, I wanted to give a little bit of theory and grounding for discussion points and facilitation tips for this week. So honing in on the relationship between people and the city, I wanted to give a quick overview and just share this article series from The Guardian. It's called the Wild City series. And this focuses all about the relationship between people and nature. To call out one specific article, there is an article that's about not just weeds and how rebel botanists are calling out and bringing purpose to some of the forgotten plant species that are existing within the city. So highly recommended to check this out. And continuing on that idea of people and the city, I wanted to call out a specific example or a great way to analyze the way that we interact with nature in the city, and that's through spontaneous urban vegetation. These are often called weeds, and these play very important roles in cities. So cities are very stressful environments. They have harsh soils. Natural geological cycles are disrupted in cities, and construction also places physical limitations on where plants can survive. In spite of all of those things, these amazing SUV species are able to grow and thrive in extreme environments. So for example, on brick buildings or on fences. And so these plants are what we have, and they serve important ecosystem functions. And yet they are sort of given a bad rap, right? So we think of them as not welcome, they're an eyesore, and yet they're actually serving important ecological function. They're helping stabilize root systems or foundations of buildings. They're providing green to the city. They're providing habitats for different organisms. So these species are actually super important ecosystemically. They're performing critical functions, and yet we place this value judgment upon them simply because we think that they're weeds. And a lot of this rhetoric actually comes from just social understanding of plants and how we categorize them. In particular, honing on an invasive species or immigrant species, are sometimes called. A lot of these labels started being applied to plant species as people started to come to the United States more and more. And so we, around that time, started to think about, well, these plants that people are bringing with them from different places are not serving the native function of different plants. They don't look like things that were traditionally here before, even if they're performing important functions that other species can perform. And so it's just a sort of interesting story about how we're categorizing plants and thinking about how, not even how ecosystems change, but what sort of plants can thrive in challenging conditions. Looking more towards people and cities, we often categorize things as biotic and abiotic, or living and non-living. And biotic are things we often think about. They're things we see, like plants and even ourselves and our pets, but also things we can't see, like the microbes that, for example, live on all of the surfaces that we interact with. Of course, there are also abiotic factors. So these are things that we see in the ground, sticks and rocks and dead leaves, but they're also processes. So you can think about construction or rain or other geological factors as abiotic factors that influence the way that we live. And this is an image from the zine that is for the tangible ecosystem activity. So thinking about how do we categorize things, I wanted to bring up some of the examples that you all contributed. Starting with Heather from Philadelphia, she was able to find only green objects. And I think this is a really great and interesting way to sort. You're looking for particular objects in the ecosystem and categorizing them just on a single trait, which I think is a great place to start in terms of categorizing the environment around you. Ellen contributed a little bit, something incorporating more layers. So she includes a lot of round objects and sorts them by color and also shape. So you can imagine that as you bring in more factors for sorting, the way that you're sorting and the way that you're including different objects gets a little bit more complex. A great way to bring in your own expertise, for example, is using edible plants. I know that people have a strong interest in understanding what is edible in the ecosystem, what is not. So Carol Ann and her sort collected species and decided, well, these ones are not edible at all. These ones are partially edible, and these ones are entirely edible. So you can bring in this expertise that you have and different technologies. So in this case, Carol Ann actually used Google Lens to help determine which species were and were not edible. And it's just a different way to incorporate tech or interests that are relevant for your patrons. You can also get a little bit more complex in your sort. So Karen, thank you for this contribution. Karen sorted by objects relative to the height that it was found and how long the object seems to have been on the ground. So immediately you're introducing more complexity by using multiple axes and also introducing a physical or spatial component to your sort. So all of those gave us a sort of hint of the taste for this week's activity, of course, the tangible ecosystem. And again, this activity is largely about expanding our toolkit. So last week we looked at our sensorial observation of the ecosystem, and this is getting more into the physical. What are different ways that we can collect? So we can use things like picking, we can map different collections or locations. If you choose to, you can use photography. And there's also other methods like pressing, rubbing, and even interviewing people that you find. Or you can even pretend to interview a plant and think about what that plant species might say. And these are just examples. So these are just jumping off points for you and your patrons to start to explore. So any other ideas, I think you should certainly contribute. And in the purpose of using all of these different collection methods, you're creating a collection, and not only creating a collection, but curating your collection in some way. And this is what you all had practice doing in your exploration prompt this week. Some ways to think about categorizing are by a single trait or a broad trait like taxonomy, like Heather's green sort, so you can use color, size, or shape. And you can also hone in on specific components or shapes of different ecosystem components to create a phylogeny. And that's where you're using more specific details of an object to sort it. And so in running these workshops, we have just a couple of facilitation tips that I think will really contribute to the success of your workshop or activity. And the first relates to creating a diverse collection of objects. So in running the first activity, which is this Venn diagram exercise, basically the more is merrier, as many things as you can bring with you for patrons to sort. So a mix of abiotic and biotic factors, but also trying to think about ways to incorporate things that we can't see or cannot immediately grab. So we ended up doing bacteria and clouds on sticky notes for the patrons to incorporate into their sorts, and also used vials to bring along things like dirt and water. Another important idea is giving multiple ways of sorting objects. So when we first ran this, we found that if we only did a Venn diagram to sort objects, then when it came down to it, all the patrons were only interested in doing a Venn diagram. So you want to show multiple ways of completing a different sort. So in addition to the Venn diagram, in this case, we also did a living spectrum. So instead of having those two sort of clean-cut categories, we stretched it out in a spectrum and found that objects kind of became harder to place. Another facilitation tip is encouraging using different ways of collecting. So people will never naturally gravitate to just simply collecting objects and taping them into the field journal, particular younger patrons. But this is an important time to expand that toolkit. And one great way to do this is by you, the facilitator, demonstrating different methods of collection. So when we were running this in Somerville, I basically just did the tree rubbing or bark rubbings to show that this was an important method of collecting. And so when I started to do the rubbings, then everyone sort of became interested in this. So make sure to demonstrate or just model for people different ways of collecting in the ecosystem. Another tip is continuing to engage the field journal. So the field journal, we noticed, was a critical component for noting where objects came from, the time of day that they were found, and the location that they were found. And so making sure that you're not only using the field journal to keep note of where you're collecting things from, but also as a place to store all of the different objects that you're finding. And so I wanted to share a couple of examples from the sorts that our patrons did in our play test. And there's lots of different varieties here. So these are just examples that get you sort of inspired in case you need some ideas. The first example is just simply by categories that the two patrons decided to work on. And it's a mix of biotic and abiotic. You can see there's a junk category for all the things that don't necessarily fit into other places. But a great mix of things found on the ground and also clippings of things from living organisms. Here, of course, is a sort by color. And what I think is really interesting about this one is the photographs and the rubbings in this are actually perceived by their color and not by necessarily the material or texture shown on those rubbings or photographs. So just incorporating sort of cool ways of thinking about the objects that you collect in that way, seeing the multiple different properties of the object that you collect and how to sort it. Here's a case where, again, collecting more objects can lead to really cool sorts. This is a sort by size. And you'll also notice that in this case, the sortings were completed outside. And so given the way that you run this activity, that can also be a really cool way to energize and even find more ecosystem components to categorize as you're making these diagrams. A last quick facilitation tip is to complete your own sort alongside your participants. So it's a great way to sort of what we saw before of creating multiple different axes in case you want to demonstrate a more complex sort. And it's also a chance to, if people finish their sort more quickly, they can also help you with your own sort. And so it's just a combination of modeling, more complex ways of thinking about the ecosystem and demonstrating those probing questions, but also just a great way to have everyone come together at the end of a session to create one great sort together. So with that, I think we'll head into our breakout sessions where you will all brainstorm how to bring this activity to your library.
Great. We're going to be opening up those breakout sessions momentarily. Like we have in the past few events, there'll be a tech help room. If you are having any issues with your camera or microphone, please feel free just to hop in there. Otherwise, I think we're going to open up the breakout room now, and we'll see you back here in around 25 or 30 minutes. Great. Thanks, everyone.